Hi, everybody. I'm Betsy Bowman, and I want to welcome you to Sailor Made Folk Art of the Sea. This is a unique experience for us, and we're thrilled to have you join us. And we also want to just thank you so much for your support at the annual fund at the America and the Sea Society. Can't tell you how much we appreciate it and how important it is to the museum. I have a couple of colleagues that are joining me today, helping to make this presentation possible. One of them is Libby Daly, who's the Associate Director of Membership, and she's making sure that people who are in the waiting room get in and helping people with any technical difficulties if they have any. Also, we have Elisa Engelman, who's our Director of Exhibits here, and she's going to go over some ground rules with you. She'll also be the person who's coordinating the questions, the Q&A. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm passing the baton to Elisa.
Thank you, Betsy. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker, Mirelle, today. As Betsy said, my name is Elisa Engelman. I'm Director of Exhibits here at Mystic Seaport Museum. And we are delighted to be sharing a sneak peek of this upcoming exhibit with you. During this Zoom presentation, while all the rest of us are going to be muted while Mirelle gives her presentation. We expect and anticipate you're going to have some great questions and comments. And so I encourage you, as those questions and comments bubble up in your brain, to use the chat function and enter those in. You can either send them directly to me, or you can post them for everyone to see. And then when Mirelle is done with her presentation, after I think she said it's running about 35 minutes or so, then I will moderate and organize the comments and questions for her to answer, and we'll have a nice chance to hear back from her on our reactions and our questions based on that. So everyone else, all of us will be muted except for when Mirelle or I are speaking or we pass the baton. As you may remember, Sailor Made is one of 4 Luce funded exhibits that we have within a 3-year time span, and we're very appreciative of the Henry Luce Foundation and their funding to make these possible. The goal of this multi-exhibit project is to bring out from our vault some special collections, things for which we might be renowned or things that maybe haven't seen light of day in a while, to bring on board some new emerging talent within curatorial profession, and to present a different spin on some of those collection pieces so that our existing audience, our fans, can see things in a new way. And also so we can expand that audience to people who might be interested in decorative arts or fine arts, but not necessarily identify as being interested in the maritime world. So those are the 2 goals with all of these projects. And along the way, it's been such a delight to work with Mirelle and with the other assistant curator and the guest curator, because we are seeing things through new eyes through them. Mirelle comes to us with a PhD in history, and she's also a former Munson Institute fellow, and so she brings a wealth of experience, and she spent the last year plus researching, preparing, scouring the collections for this exhibit. And she is now leaving us at the end of this project period. She will become the humanities curator at the Mid-America Arts Alliance in Kansas City, Missouri. So she's leaving the coast and heading inland, and that begins in June 22nd. So before she leaves us, it was really important for us to not only complete the planning work for the exhibit, which we've done, but also to use tools like Zoom to share the current the completion of her thinking and curatorial approach for the exhibit. So we're delighted that she's doing that. And this Sailor Made collection is quite a remarkable one. Some of these pieces might be familiar to you, and others are definitely things that haven't seen the light of day in a while. So as I said, after Mirelle's presentation, we'll have time for some questions and discussion. So please be sure to write those in. Type them into the chat function. If you have any questions, if you haven't used Zoom before, please reach out to Libby. And she is on our Zoom screen called Mystic Seaport Museum because she's the one organizing it, but she's also available via email. Let her know if you have any technical problems. If you get your internet connection gets interrupted or the screen freezes, wait it out a little bit. If you still have problems, you might want to log out and log back in. That can sometimes happen when we have a large number of people attending a Zoom program. Let me just check with my colleagues and see. Betsy, Mirelle, Libby, did I forget anything before I pass the baton?
No, I think you got it perfect.
Okay, great. Mirelle, you're on, and we're looking forward to seeing Sailor Made.
All right, great. Elisa, thanks so much for the intro. And Betsy and Libby, thank you for organizing this and making everything happen on the Zoom front. So I'm really excited by this opportunity to talk a little bit about my exhibit. I've had such a great time over the last year and a half exploring the archives and doing research and putting this together. So any chance I have to talk about what I've found, I get really jazzed and psyched about it. So this is a really great opportunity for me. So what I want to do today is kind of talk a little bit about the development process of the exhibit, talk about some of the themes that the exhibit's exploring, and then dive into some stories related to some of the specific artifacts. So as Elisa mentioned, I was hired through a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, and part of the purpose of the grant was to highlight the museum's collections and really focus on objects in the museum as objects of art. So I've been looking at things that sailors made, things that professional mariners made at sea, and looking at them as folk art, looking at them for their aesthetic value, and also emphasizing that these were things created by not professional artists, but by people who had creative impulses and artistic talents and were expressing themselves through the things that they created. Just a second, gotta figure out how to make this go to the next slide. There we go, all right. So Mystic Seaport, as most of you probably know, has an incredibly rich and uniquely deep collection of sailor-made art, which has been collected for decades since the museum's founding. So the collection ranges from some 1,400 scrimshaw and scrimshaw-related objects, including whale teeth, which you see just a small sampling here. You can see in the photograph, some of them are already being pulled to get ready for this exhibit. So things like whale teeth, busks, walrus tusks, and similar objects. But also things like fancy knotwork and macrame, things like belts, decoration on knives and fids, and even handbags like you see here. This is a handbag made from sail twine with tortoiseshell handles. And one of the things I really like about it is that it has a heart embroidered on one side, and then the other side, the sailor artist worked the name or the initials of his wife into the back of it. So things also like hand-sewn clothes, bags, and hammocks, a Civil War era sailor suit, and a hammock, as you see here, made to fit a child. Also embroidery and crewel work, which is embroidery worked in wool, like this wool picture made by a British sailor, and drawings and logbooks and personal journals. So with this vast array of objects, the Seaport really has this really deep collection that allows us to look at sailor-made art from a lot of different perspectives. Often when people think about sailor-made art, they think immediately about scrimshaw, and that's kind of where my mind went when I first started working at the museum. So I was really excited to see how these different things are all connected and how sailors on whale ships, but also merchant ships, and naval vessels were all creating art in these moments of spare time that they had. And so I was really able to dig in and look at why sailors created art at sea and what they were thinking about, perhaps, while they created this art. So I started out this project by kind of diving into all of the literature I could find. So I did a lot of research on the 19th century maritime world, but I also wanted to see what was inspiring sailors culturally. So what was happening in the United States in the 19th century that might have impacted the creation of this art. So I researched things like American folk art, American industrialization, attitudes towards work, and even the popular press. So you see kind of themes and motifs in the sailor art appearing in other parts of American culture at the time. So sailors are taking magazines that are spreading across the country, and they're copying images from these magazines onto the teeth, both fashion plates and political images. They are taking popular culture styles, things like corsets, and making busks. And they're also recreating folk art imagery, so things like hearts, for example, and putting these things onto the art that they're creating. So you see this back and forth. Sailors are creating this art far out at sea, far from home, but they're not creating it in a vacuum. They're drawing on popular culture ideas to create this art. So what I found when I dug into the vault was that sailors are really responding to emerging ideas of leisure in the 19th century. So I mentioned I researched industrialization, and part of what this meant in the 19th century is that people are increasingly going to work at places like factories, and then they're coming home, which is a new thing. So people have new ideas about how they're spending both their time at work and their time at home. And this idea of leisure, that you should have time at home to do fun things, to express yourself, is becoming increasingly popular in the 19th century. And so when sailors are creating this scrimshaw and knotwork and other objects, they're drawing on their moments of leisure time on the ship to, again, express themselves, have free time, have a little bit of fun in this really hard work environment. Through their art, sailors are able to turn away from the workings of the ship, take time for themselves, and create these objects. So as I developed this exhibit, I want to share with visitors the skill that sailors brought to their art, even though they weren't trained as artists. And also I wanted to emphasize the intentionality of sailor-made art. While a sailor might have incised an image onto a sperm whale tooth as a way to pass the time, he was also doing something that was really time consuming. He had to sand the tooth down, he had to polish it, he had to make these really, really intricate etchings. So it was an involved process that required skill and forethought, and also creative expression. So in this exhibit, I came up with 3 major themes to explore about why sailors are creating art and what they're thinking about. And these are going to be shown on 3 freestanding facades in C.D. Mallory, which is the exhibit space where this exhibit is going. So the themes that I'm trying to highlight are looking at how art shows sailors' connections to shipboard life. So things like this pan bone, which shows a working scene and explores sailors' working worlds. How art reflects sailors' thoughts about culture on shore. So for example, as I mentioned, sailors take fashion plates from magazines and they carve them onto teeth, reflecting popular culture ideas about femininity, fashion, and things like that. And then the third theme is how sailors use art to help them remember experiences and remember their travels. So for instance, things like this busk, which a sailor carved on carved into it a picture of a foreign port scene, a tropical port scene. So he's remembering his experiences in this port that he may have seen on his journey. And he's also sharing this experience with the woman who received this busk as a gift. So these 3 themes about the ship, the shore, and souvenirs are kind of the guiding force in the exhibit, and looking again at how sailors were inspired to create art and what they're hoping to share. So as Elisa mentioned, the exhibit was kind of well on its way to opening when COVID-19 stopped the world in its tracks, and we kind of had to take a break. Of course, the museum is only just starting to reopen at the end of this week. And also the opening date of the exhibit has been pushed back. And quarantine had a really interesting effect on how I was thinking about this exhibit. And I realized that our current experiences of being separated from loved ones, with my lovely stock photo here of being separated from loved ones, really give us insight into the world of 19th century sailors. This idea of separation, but also this idea of being confined and not being able to move freely like you want to. So like sailors in the 19th century, a lot of us in these last couple months have been separated from friends and loved ones. We've been faced with kind of limited supplies. And we've been in this environment like sailors where work duties and leisure time overlap. Many of us are working from home and we're trying to get our usual amount of office work done from home offices or even closets while we're interacting with family members and trying to homeschool kids. So I think that it's a really interesting moment where we can kind of see some of the things that sailors might have faced in a way that we never could have before. I had for months been talking about how people won't be able to fathom these experiences of 19th century sailors, but we're just in this new environment where people can relate to this impulse to create art in an environment where there's nothing else to do in kind of a new way. And interestingly, people have turned to crafting to pass the time, much like sailors did. So I just did a couple of screenshots here of things that people are doing. So again, people are, they're crocheting, they're knitting, they're drawing. There's the whole sourdough craze. And I think it's really interesting that even in this world of internet connections and streaming on demand movies, people are still turning to these tangible, handcrafted products to kind of get out of your head and really be able to do something that creates connection and also allows you to focus on something that's not just kind of this static present moment where we're stuck in one place. I mean, myself, I've been crafting up a storm, jumping on the sourdough craze. I've been making quilts, and I thought I'd share. I even made bandanas for all of my pets. So anyway, trying to tie a bandana on a cat really does kind of take you out of being stuck in quarantine for a moment. So in a way, COVID-19 has really provided us with this connection to the past. And the current experience has really underscored for me the solace that people can find in art. And I found this newfound connection to these mostly anonymous sailor makers. So for example, we don't know who made this tooth. We don't really know very much about it. It's been in the collection for many, many decades. But it's one of the pieces that really stands out to me and that I particularly love. On the one hand, it's a really typical whaling scene on a tooth. You've got a ship, you've got the sailors in the whaleboat. It's very similar to the scene on the panbone that I showed earlier. But then on the other hand, you can see these really unique waves that the artist chose to inscribe on the tooth, and they're kind of these half circles. You can't see it in this image, but they actually move onto the back of the tooth as well. And they're this really, really unique green color that I've never seen before. And I really love this tooth because it points to the fact that even though we don't know who made this tooth, we don't know what he was thinking when he made it, you can really see this process of artistic decisions and also design making coming into the process. He made really specific choices when he decided to craft this tooth. And I think it's a really good reminder that these were individuals that made all of these objects. And they were responding to specific instances in their own lives as they made them. So I'd like to turn now to some of the objects that we do know a little bit more about and tell some stories that I think really highlight how life at sea shaped what sailors created. So this is an image, a daguerreotype of Sarah Wardell Smith, known as Sally. Sally was the wife of a whaling captain, Frederick Smith, and she joined him at sea on a 3-year whaling voyage in the 1870s. So Sally was one of many, many women who joined their captain husbands at sea in the 1900s. It was actually a moderately common practice for women to join their husbands at sea on these long voyages. One of the things that makes Sally really interesting for us is that we happen to know a fair amount about her. The museum has her journal that she kept on this voyage in the collection. It's actually digitized online if anyone wants to go search for it after this and read through it. And we also have a number of objects that we have one thing that Sally made and a lot of things that her husband Fred made, because they were both artists when they went to sea, and they made things during this voyage. So after researching Sally and Fred and doing some deep dives into the census records, I learned a little bit more about her, and this kind of background really gave a new meaning to the art that she created. So one of the things I realized was that Sally went to sea. The thing that prompted her to go to sea with Fred was that their only child, Eddie, died of diphtheria in 1874, just a couple years before she went to sea. At the time, Fred was home, and then the next voyage that he went on, she joined him. And so this is kind of a really personal and humanizing event in this woman's life that we can relate to even decades later. Armed with this knowledge, I started reading through her journal to see what she made of life at sea. Like a lot of journals at this time, Sally's journal is fairly rote. It's not very personal. She mostly describes the weather. In this top entry, she says, "blowing worse than yesterday." So she describes the weather. She describes what the crew members are doing. She doesn't really talk a lot about what she thinks about life at sea or what her own personal experiences are like. I was really interested to see, she has this one entry on this particular page. In the margin, you can see she wrote birthday 11 years, and this was written on Eddie's birthday. So you can see this one kind of instance of a very personal moment that she puts into this otherwise fairly impersonal journal. And I don't really have a lot to make of this, but I think it's definitely something that's worth kind of pointing out and remembering kind of the choices that Sally made to get to sea and why she's there with Fred, and what she's doing on this ship in the middle of the ocean. One of the things that you can kind of read from the journal, even though she doesn't say, "I was bored, there was nothing to do." She writes again and again things like this: "Employed cutting in the whale, my part is to look on and see the rest work." And this refrain, "I'm looking on and seeing the rest work," comes up again and again in the journal. So again, she doesn't say she's bored, but you can see it there. You can see it between the lines that she doesn't really have anything to do. And for many of these women that followed their husbands to sea, their lives were very confined. They kind of stayed in the cabins. Some of them rarely came on deck. They couldn't walk around the ship at will because it was dangerous. They'd be in the way. And many of the domestic duties that they might have been doing at home, like keeping house or cooking or cleaning, are done by members of the crew. So they just don't have a lot to do. So like sailors who are trying to occupy time when they're not sailing or when they're waiting for whales, Sally turns to art. So one of the things that she made was this fan. She also writes in her journal about making a quilt, which hasn't survived as far as we know, but we do have this wonderful fan in the collection where you can see it's made of cloth. Sally painted her initial and also these flowers on the fan, and then there's a whalebone handle which was made on a lathe, a carpenter's tool, to make it round like that. And Fred or Sally might have made the handle. And one of the things that's so interesting about this fan is that it's very of the moment. So we look at this and we're like, oh, okay, this is a fan. But I found out this kind of fan was really popular in the mid to late 19th century. So these two fans are from the Fan Museum in Greenwich, England. There's a museum dedicated to fans. And it really struck me how similar these fans are to the one that Sally made. So you can again see this garland of flowers. These happen to be embroidered rather than painted. And they also have ivory handles. I don't know what kind of ivory, it didn't say on their archive website, but in making this fan, Sally is both giving herself something to do on the ship, giving herself a project, but she's also finding connection to the life that she left behind on land. She's making these fans that are very popular and fashionable in the world that she comes from. And so she's engaging with culture, and she's engaging with what she left behind when she makes this fan. And I really like to imagine her sitting on the deck, not looking on and seeing the rest work, but making this fan. And then once it's made, she can sit on the deck, watch the rest work, and stay cool while using her fan. So one of the reasons that I highlight this fan in the exhibit is because it really became clear to me, in addition to kind of the wide variety of things that sailors are making at sea, our understanding of who are professional sailors at sea definitely needs to be much broader than we typically think of. We think of these young men from New England fishing villages, which are certainly a large portion of the people who are going to sea, but there's also people like Sally who, while she's not getting paid, she's also not a passenger. She is at sea in a somewhat professional capacity. And then there's also people like this man, Tasiuk, who again kind of challenges our ideas of who counts as a mariner, who is working in the maritime world of the 19th century. So this man, Tasiuk, was a leader of the Inuit Avalingmuit community in the Arctic. This photo was taken in the early 1900s by George Comer, who was a whaling captain in the Arctic. And our own curator, Fred Calabretta, has done a lot of research on both Arctic whaling and George Comer more specifically. And I know he's given some talks in this museum as its closed series about the Arctic, which can be looked up again if anyone wants to know more. At any rate, though, Tasiuk and Comer worked really closely together for some 20 years as Comer went to the Arctic on voyages. And Tasiuk was kind of Comer's helper and fixer in the Arctic. Comer nicknamed him Harry, and he helped provide Comer's crews with knowledge about the region, supplies, and things like that. And particularly as Comer's vessels were there for season after season or stuck in the ice or things like that, Tasiuk moved between his own community and Comer's whale ships. So again, while he's not maybe what we first think of when we think of someone being a sailor, he is certainly very invested in this maritime community and working in this maritime world. And so I think it's really important to see kind of what things he created and how this idea of folk art at sea expands well beyond kind of just our initial thoughts. So this is a cribbage board that Tasiuk created, and you can really see the exchange of cultures between Comer and Tasiuk that's happening with this cribbage board. It's made from a walrus tusk, as you can see, and the board combines this common sailor game, cribbage, with designs that are very specific to Tasiuk's own experiences and his artistic preferences. So in addition to the inscribed images you can see on the board, note the 3D walrus and seal figures, which are fairly unusual for cribbage boards at this time. So these are some images of some other cribbage boards we have in our collection. Comer made the top one. And you can see that making cribbage boards was actually a fairly common thing for sailors to do. But for the most part, sailors, American or European descended sailors, made cribbage boards that were kind of one-dimensional, or they inscribed images onto them. They inscribed images onto them similar to how they would inscribe images onto a sperm whale tooth. There aren't these 3D figures like you see on Tasiuk's board. And so having 3D figures like this shows kind of how Tasiuk is melding two different cultures together. The idea of making a cribbage board, playing and participating in this popular game that Comer and his crew are participating in, but also making these really unique figures that come out of his own artistic preferences and experiences. So cribbage itself is part of this long history of finding time and finding ways, finding time for yourself and finding ways to occupy yourself at sea. Cribbage was invented in the 1600s, and apparently sailors picked it up very quickly and were playing it on sailing ships all over the place, making boards, as you saw in the previous slide, and generally enjoying themselves. During World War II, I learned cribbage became particularly popular in the US Navy. It was played on US naval submarines while they were patrolling for Japanese ships, as you can see in the black and white image. In 1943, rather, cribbage became cemented as part of the culture of the US Navy when a perfect cribbage hand combined with a record number of Japanese ships sunk by the USS Wahoo made cribbage the unofficial pastime of US submarines. And so the board you can see in the color photograph is actually a board that came from the USS Wahoo, and now it's always on the oldest submarine, working submarine in the USS fleet. And so now it's on the USS Bremerton. And I think this is just such a great connection that we go from this board made by an Inuit mariner and community leader made from a walrus tusk to this board that is now floating around on American submarines. And it really shows how this desire to find something to do, to enjoy yourself, to kind of find time in this ship is really universal, and it carries through into the modern era. As kind of a further example of how the creation of art at sea comes full circle, another item that we're including in the exhibit is a cribbage board made by a retired submariner who learned to play the game and became really invested in it when he was in the Navy. Now he's retired and he makes cribbage boards for fun as a form of folk art. And so we're going to compare and show the differences and similarities between Tasiac's board and this modern submarine-shaped cribbage board made by a submariner. So again, throughout this exhibit, I've wanted to show that people created art for a variety of different reasons, but they're doing it in this environment that is largely inhospitable to having kind of free space, being able to move around as you want. And so by creating art, sailors are really able to take a moment for themselves and shut out the world around them. So by focusing on these projects that are so personal, they can think about kind of their where they want to be, where they hope they'll be in the future, and things like that, and really express themselves. So to close, I just wanted to leave you some questions to ponder that are going in the exhibit, and again, pointing to these different themes. Just some images of sailor creators. But the questions I wanted to ask you to ponder, when you're stuck in one place, how do you create leisure time? What do you do to kind of entertain yourself and make time when you're not working stand out, feel special and fun? If you live far from loved ones, what do you do to feel close to them? And when you travel, how do you remember your adventures? And I hope you pondering these questions now and also asking visitors to ponder these questions in the exhibit will really highlight the through lines between sailors in the 19th century creating art on whale teeth and things that we can't get anymore, would never see, and the things that we do ourselves to really scratch the itch and get at the same impulses. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirelle. That's fascinating. Thank you. And I had heard you speak about quite a bit of that, but some of it was new to me, which is delightful. So we've had several questions that I can convey, and the first is any items you came across that were really unusual. And I guess you can define what unusual means, either new to you or things that you think visitors might find unusual or that stand out from the collection or from other similar collections, however you decide to define it.
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's so many objects and it's hard to choose. So I think two that I would say are particularly unusual. One probably a lot of you have heard about and seen, but it remains just so unusual, is the narwhal tusk coat rack. It's definitely one of a kind, something that's really unique. It was made by an Arctic whaling captain, John Spicer. He captured these narwhals himself, and so there's 4 narwhal tusks making kind of the hat part where you put the hats on the coat rack, and then he used exotic woods from the Hawaiian Islands to make other parts of the coat rack. And it's such an incredible piece. It's so big and so unusual. And narwhal tusks are just so striking, that I think that's definitely one of the most unusual pieces. But also things like the sail twine macrame handbag. That's something that was unexpected. I didn't ever really think about sailors making things. I knew they made, knot work. They'd make monkey's fists or do knots on handles of things, but it never really occurred to me that they'd be making these kind of fine macrame things, either for themselves or for loved ones at home. So that's kind of another unexpected thing that I ran across.
Yeah, I think that will be a surprise to many of our visitors as well. And as you raise in the exhibit, those questions, issues of masculinity and femininity, are fascinating ones to explore. Another question, have you encountered anything that conveys emotional connections to home or friends? So I guess that might be more of the shore section, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, the one that my mind went to was in the souvenir section. So these themes are definitely, these themes are malleable. They're all interconnected. But one of the things that really makes you think about how people are thinking about life at home is the hammock. So let's see we'll go back to this window. So this hammock was made by a sailor named Charles Sinclair, and it was made for his friend Calendar St. George Noland, and Sinclair made it for Noland's children to sleep in. So it's a naval style hammock, but it was made child size for children to sleep in. And so you can think about the friendship that these two guys struck up while they were at sea together, talking about their family, the people they had left behind. And then Sinclair goes to the effort to make this hammock for his friend, who actually named his first son after Sinclair. So they had this really close connection. But again, they're at sea, but they're thinking about home and they're sharing parts of themselves. And then Sinclair is making something that's very, very specifically sea-based. He's making a hammock that looks like a sailor's hammock, but its intended purpose is to be in the home and be used for children. And so you really see kind of the overlap there between life at sea and life on land, and kind of how both the people on the ship and the people at home are kind of constantly thinking of each other and wanting to have these connections and ways to feel closer to each other.
And what a special thing that that object takes on a whole significance when it comes back and is in a family than what it did when it was made at sea or made following a voyage. Within that family, that takes on a whole new meaning. I can see that.
Yeah.
So I have a question about influence.
Yeah.
So thinking about the cribbage boards, right? I'm a third generation cribbage player, and my grandfather learned in the Navy and passed it on to my dad, who passed it on to me. And, there's some things you can't avoid on a cribbage board. You have to have the holes for the pegs. It's a 2-player game, so you have to have parallel rows. But within that, there's a lot of variation of form, and you showed some images that are really remarkable in the differences, how they play with that. And I wanted to hear more, or have you talk a little bit more about this idea of influence. And so you've talked about, sailors being caught in a small place with limited materials. They're drawing from their own imagination, they're drawing from published sources, but they're also drawing from each other. And so do you have any stories or any examples of things where you can see a ship-based influence of one sailor making something and it then influences what somebody else makes? Is that a possible transmission of style, of approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a whole number of examples of this. So interestingly, apparently it was really common practice for particularly good drawers to draw in other sailors' logbooks, or journals rather. So you'd see, even if two ships met on like a gam. So one sailor whose journal we have, Robert Weir, he has drawings in a variety of other people's logbooks, some sailors that he wasn't even on their cruise, because people saw him drawing and were like, you're really good at that, please share with me. But then also another really interesting thing that's going in the exhibit is this Swift, which is kind of this umbrella shaped contraption made out of whalebone that you'd use to wind skeins of yarn into balls of yarn for knitting and things like that. And this particular Swift goes in a box and mounts on the box. And this idea of making a Swift combined with a box, it seems fairly like, okay, that makes sense, you'd make both, but it's not particularly common. But several were made on this one ship, the Mechanic. The one that we have was made by Spencer Pratt, who was a mate on the ship. And there's another one in the Mariners Museum that was made by the captain. So you see this this idea of people are all thinking of, oh, that's a really good idea. I'm going to make a box too. That looks really snazzy. It's easier to carry it that way. And so yeah, this is definitely something that's very personal, and you're making your own things, but these are really tiny spaces. Everyone can see what everybody else is doing. And you can definitely see the repetition of certain ideas again and again.
Great, thank you. Oh, let's see, here's a question. Oh, have you found any evidence of men knitting or quilting at sea?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wish we had some actual objects. All we have, like I say, there's a sailor suit made by a sailor, but not of any quilts specifically made by sailors. But in several of the journals, you mentioned there's one where a sailor talks about how it's really cold, so they're going to start knitting hats. And there are a couple of other instances like that where sailors talk about things that they're making very offhandedly in journals.
Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty rare. I think it's enough. They were definitely doing it, but
yeah,
it's hard to find the material culture today showing that they were doing it.
So didn't Sally Smith and Fred Smith, didn't they like teach each other crafts? Wasn't that part of how they, am I remembering that correctly? Where she said, he's teaching me this and I'm teaching him that.
Yeah, I think, now I can't remember exactly, but I know she would specifically ask him to make things for her, like, can you make me these clothespins or knitting needles and things like that. Now I can't remember if she did teach him how to knit or if she just made knitting needles, but they definitely had a big back and forth between what they were making while they were on the ship. Yeah.
That's neat. So continuing the thread of the analogy to today and the relevance, there was a really good question from this viewer saying, I found that creating during the pandemic has been my way of coping with fear. So the creative impulse, coming out of this need to grapple with the fear. Are there specific examples of how art helped the creators coped with the experience of fear of dangers of life and work at sea, and of course whaling, like one of the more dangerous maritime endeavors of the time? So are there examples where you see them kind of grappling with that fear of the sea, of the whales, of the world, weather?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I love the way that is phrased, this idea of creating to cope with fear, because that definitely, it resonates and it totally makes sense. So that's something that I think is definitely true and they're doing, but that's one of those things that I can only infer because as I was talking about with Sally Smith's journal, it's really rare for even people in their personal journals to really talk about what they're feeling. It's very much describing the weather and describing what they're doing. Personal journals very much follow the form of an official logbook, so there might be some tidbits here and there. Occasionally you get a sailor like Robert Weir, who I mentioned, who's particularly chatty in his journal, and he's sarcastic about what he's doing, but it's not common for sailors to talk about kind of, I guess, what's in their heart, or kind of the way that we would write in a journal today. So I'm convinced that they were doing that, but to find direct evidence is pretty near impossible, and you kind of have to just piece it together from, you know, common sense and the types of things that they were making and things like that. Yeah, so it's just indirect.
All those whaling scenes, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, there was one question. Let me scroll back up. Oh, one new message. You mentioned, how Harry, the Tasiuk, the Inuit who worked with Captain Comer, how he input his own culture in his work. Are there other pieces in the collection or in the exhibit that express a sailor's own race or ethnicity? Are there things that hint at a background that might be different than what you rightly pointed out? We all tend to think of the prototypical Yankee farm boy going to sea. Are there other pieces that you know of that express a different race or ethnic background?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I knew I really wanted to make sure I paid attention to when I started working at the museum and started thinking about this exhibit, but kind of perhaps unsurprisingly found really difficult to actually be able to emphasize, because so many of the objects are by unknown makers. So there's a little over 100 objects that are going in the exhibit, and we know who made maybe 30 of them, which is actually a lot, but not very many. And just because of the way things are preserved and saved, we know who made something if their family was kind of stable enough to be able to hang on to it for generations and generations, and then we're able to give it to the museum. And so those kind of end up being the same sorts of people, and so it's really hard to know who made a lot of the objects, and so it's hard to be able to kind of point to other examples. So some of the things that I have been able to find is we've actually got a number of really excellent photographs of sailors showing off their artwork or showing off things that they made. So we've got some images of sailors from a number of different ethnicities holding their canes that they made in a posed photograph. There's another photograph of a sailor holding a shadow box image of a ship that he made, to hopefully help point out to visitors that this is kind of a wide range of people that are creating things. One really interesting thing I learned when I was doing this research into folk art, I ran across this dissertation by a woman who cataloged different types of folk art imagery that appeared in sailor art. And one of her arguments was that you could see as more and more Azorian descendant or Azorian Catholic whalemen became really common in the whaling industry, these heart images changed. So apparently in Catholic imagery, a heart with kind of a pointy curved tail on it is very common, whereas in Protestant cultures, the heart is symmetrical, like you see on this heart on this handbag. And so her argument was that as more and more hearts appear in sailor art that have this curved tail, you can see that the ships are becoming more diverse. And to the extent that we can date things, that does seem to be the case. So that's something that, yeah, you wouldn't know unless you had all that background, but was really kind of an exciting find for me, yeah.
Great. One more question. And if you'd like, what I could do is share, while you're answering that question, I can get primed a view of one of the display walls, and I'm thinking of the one that has the photo of the three young gentlemen dressed up with their canes. And if you'd like, I can probably share that screen so people can see that as an example.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But first, while I get that queued up, there was a question, interesting question. What is the rarest item that you found, the most rare? And again, like, wow, how do you interpret that? So any response to that while I get this queued up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my initial thought is just all of it, because so much of this stuff it's either animal byproducts or like fabric, which just doesn't typically last and kind of falls apart. But I think something that I've never seen before is this long piece of baleen. So the baleen that comes out of a right whale's mouth, that's, I don't know how long, maybe 4 or 5 feet long, and it still has the little bristles sticking out of it. And a sailor took it and he scrimshawed it, he carved into it. So you get pieces of baleen to make ditty boxes or busks or things like that, but a full piece of baleen I haven't seen anywhere else. And just the fact that it's all intact and it has the bristles on it, I think that's really incredible. Yeah.
That's neat. All right, let me see. So I have queued up the design that's in our shared Google Doc, and I'm going to see if I can share screen for a second. Here we go, share. Can you see the elevation? It says that I'm sharing. Okay, so do you want to tell us a little bit about what we see here and why it's looks the way it is, and what you're trying to you and the designers are trying to convey?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there's 3 separate freestanding facades in the exhibit, and this particular facade is looking at objects that sailors made that kind of suggest that they were thinking about or engaging with ideas of home. This is the picture I talked about, showing number of different whalemen. And this particular box in the middle is looking at ideas of masculinity. So as I did research, I learned that canes, which are kind of this, jaunty fashion item, were becoming something that was increasingly popular among kind of middle and working class men in the late 19th century. So kind of in the earlier period, it was only wealthy men who used canes, but as there's kind of more men working as clerks, and you get kind of a infusion of white collar jobs, canes start trickling down to the masses. And so sailors, one of the things they liked to do was make canes. So the majority of the canes in our collection come from whale ships, but it was something that sailors did across the board. Sailors made canes on whale ships, on Navy ships. There's accounts of sailors making canes on riverboats on the Mississippi. So it was this really popular thing that sailors liked to do. And one of the things I tried to do throughout the exhibit is pull quotes from some of the resources that we have in the museum where sailors are talking about the art that they created. So even though we don't know who made a lot of these things, whenever I could find people talking about things they were making, I really tried to highlight that. So there's a sailor who recorded in his journal that there was nothing to do but make canes to support our dignity when we are home. And so you can really think about sailors sitting on the ship making canes out of whalebone, making riding crops out of baleen, or making canes out of shark's vertebrae. So that's the curved one you can see. And then when they get to shore, they dress up in their fancy clothes rather than their dirty sailor slops and walk along the streets of a port city holding these canes and kind of flicking them around. And there's actually cartoons from the period where people are complaining that these new cane users aren't using them properly. They don't know how to use them, so they're sticking them out behind them and hitting people as they walk around. And so you really see how these ideas of masculinity in this period are kind of developing, and then how people are actually interpreting them and then reflecting them out when they go out into the world. And so this picture, the man who is standing on the end, who doesn't have the canes in front of him. He is Walter C. Van Horn, and we have a number of things of his in the collection, including a cane. And he is posing with two of his crewmates on the island of St. Helena. So after the whale ship had been at sea for a while, they go to St. Helena to resupply. They all dress up in their fancy suits with their canes that they made on the ship, and then they pose for this photograph, wearing their fancy clothes and showing off their canes. And I think it's a really interesting kind of example of, again, how sailors are far away out at sea, but these ideas that everyone in America is thinking about at the time, they're also thinking about them, and they're also reflecting this.
Great. And do you want to talk just briefly about what we see flanking that central cane display, on the right and the left? What else is on this wall? And
yeah, definitely. So the image, I can't ever tell if I should say left or right, but the one on my left with kind of the wallpaper background is looking at, I think that is looking at ideas of domesticity or femininity, and how sailors, again, are taking these popular ideas, thinking about home, thinking about what they hope home can be like for them and for their loved ones. And so the image on top you can see it's taken from Harper's Magazine, and we actually have a tooth that you can tell is a copy of that particular image. So a sailor had the magazine, and he copied this woman onto a tooth. And so kind of thinking about women's fashion, fancy dress, these are really nice clothes that most sailors' wives wouldn't have been wearing kind of on a daily basis. So I think it's very much like wish fulfillment, that like hopefully the people in my life can wear these nice clothes, or use these like jagging wheels and bodkins and things like that. Then the image on the far side is exploring how sailors are thinking about politics on the ship. So the quote there is from William Whitecar, who was a sailor who then wrote kind of popular interpretations of his time at sea, popular and embellished, but he remembered, my shipmates were thoroughly conversant with the leading topics of the day, and each had his individual opinion of, I can't read the rest of it, but basically the politics that engrossed the American mind. And you can see kind of a variety of different interpretations of a cane that has an eagle's head. There's some tattoo flash of an eagle and an American flag. And then again, kind of political imagery that appears on scrimshaw teeth, including a copy of a campaign poster from Zachary Taylor's presidential campaign, which is one that I particularly like, because Zachary Taylor is known for the Mexican-American War. He's a military guy, he's not a sailor, but this kind of popular politics of Zachary Taylor clearly spoke to this sailor who saw this campaign poster and was like, yeah, I'm gonna make this on a tooth. So yeah. Great,
thank you. So we have time for one more question, and I see a really intriguing one. Are you ready? That's a doozy. Yeah. So you've already mentioned the idea of what survives, right? And the forces that can impact what survives. Family, stability, feeling like a museum is a good place to have a family piece go. Not everybody, believes that or believes that in family. So here's a question. Are the gifts that were made more likely to survive than the items created for onboard use, which might lead to a sense that more time was spent on gifts? So, might we overthink that more gifts were made because more gifts have survived, not because they were necessarily made? That's kind of a philosophical question to think about for their last question. That was your last question.
No, that's a great one to end on. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, I think to a certain extent that would be true, because a lot of the kind of working tools and things that might have been made would have been discarded or just kind of worn into the ground. So yeah, things are made for kind of the purpose of being displayed. Mm-hmm. I think they would be more likely to be kept. I think it's interesting too, though, you see kind of what's even being kept on kind of the gift front. It does end up leaning very heavily towards you know, these teeth, and particularly teeth that have working scenes and ships and things like that on them, over things like the bodkins and jagging wheels and things like that, because you see kind of who's collecting this is particularly interested in kind of the masculine maritime world, and that's kind of what many people in the kind of early 20th century were particularly interested in remembering, was this kind of heroism of the maritime past. And so things that are specifically related to that are the things that are most likely to survive. So you're not going to get as many things that are kind of showing sailors doing knitting, or showing sailors making kind of more I don't know, things that are coded as feminine. You're not going to see as much of that for sure. But I guess we can never know what exactly got lost. That's one of the big questions, is did sailors ever make, how much pornographic teeth did they make, and did it ever survive? We don't know. We will never know. But yeah, no, that's such a fantastic question, and something we'll all have to continue to ponder.
Along with the questions that you posed at the end. Thank you. Those were great thought questions as well. So I think we're gonna wrap up and turn the mic back to Betsy, but I just wanna thank Mirelle for a great presentation and for the good discussion afterward. And thank you to the Luce Foundation and to all of our donors for supporting this exhibit and all the rest to come. We really appreciate you. And Betsy, I'll hand the mic back to you and go on mute.
Sure, thank you. So I also want to just thank all of you for being with us today, and thank you for your support. Hopefully, we're working on a new, also Zoom, American the Sea Society event that we will let you know about soon. But hopefully later in the year, we'll actually get to see you in person for an exhibit opening or another kind of American the Sea Society event. And in the meantime, thank you, and please be safe. Take care.